The Bell P-39 Airacobra and P-63 Kingcobra were quite unique fighter planes in World War II. Though they were not the most successful or best performing aircrafts, they had their strong points, and because of their unique design, they were worth looking into. To see the development of these planes, first we need to go back a few years to take a short look at the history of Bell Corporation and the predecessor of the P-39. The Bell Aircraft Corporation was only formed in 1935 after Larry Bell left Consolidated. Before working on the P-39, the company only designed one fighter plane, and if we say the Airacobra was an unusual design, then its predecessor was truly extraordinary. The Bell YFM-1 Airacobra was the company's first fighter design, and it was sold as a bomber destroyer or a mobile anti-aircraft platform. It incorporated several unusual technical features. It featured a dual-engine setup with two Ellison V1710 engines mounted in a pusher fashion. In front of each engine nacelle was a gunner position with 37mm guns. Other than those, the plane featured fixed 30-caliber machine guns and two additional 50-caliber machine guns on the waist gunners positions. It was a very futuristic-looking aircraft, but it was plagued with problems. Its role was unclear, it was heavy and slower than expected. Despite all the problems, one full squadron of these planes were assembled, and they were in service from 1938, but they never really did anything, until finally, in 1942, they were all scrapped. So the P-39 Strange Uncle was not a success story. But from 1936, Bell was already working on its successor, the plane which will become the P-39. In February 1937, specifications were set out for a single-engine high-altitude interceptor. The specifications asked for at least 1,000 pounds of heavy armament, including a cannon, Ellison liquid-cooled engine, tricycle landing gear, and at least 360 miles an hour top speed. The climb rate should have been no more than 6 minutes to 20,000 feet. Bell's proposed design was unconventional from the beginning. It featured tricycle landing gear and low-mounted wings as most fighter planes of the era, but the engine was mounted at the center of gravity above the wings. The thinking behind this arrangement was that it allows the aircraft to be more agile. At its first iteration, on the so-called Model 3, the cockpit was pushed behind the engine at the rear of the aircraft, but that was quickly dropped. On the Model 4, the cockpit was moved to the front, and the engine stayed at the center position, driving the propeller through a driveshaft. The center-mounted engine also freed up space in the front to mount the 37mm cannon in the center of the aircraft, and allowed the nose to be smooth and streamlined as well. The final design featured the same configuration, with the engine mounted in the center, the cockpit in front of it, and the armament mounted in the nose and the wings. Because of the center-mounted engine configuration, fuel could only be stored in the wings. As a side note, we can mention that later their experience with the unconventional designs was the reason the Bell Corporation was approached to build the first US jet fighter, when the British gave the plans of the turbojet engine to the US in 1941. The result was the Bell P-59 Aerocomet, the first US-built jet aircraft, which I have already made a video on. I suggest you guys watch it, as it contains original color video footage about the plane's test flights. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. Now let's get back to the P-39 history. Bell submitted their proposed aircraft to the Air Corps in 1937 for the new specification, as Model 12, and was awarded a contract for the prototype under designation XP-39. The XP-39 prototype made its maiden flight in April 1938. It managed to reach 390 miles an hour at 20,000 feet, but found to be short of the predicted performance figures. The first prototypes originally featured two scoops on each side for cooling the turbo supercharger, but this caused problems with the plane's aerodynamics. After wind tunnel testings, it was found that in the tight spaces of the XP-39, the turbo supercharger installation was not possible without a very cluttered interior, and compromises the plane's aerodynamics as well. In 1939 it was decided to go on with the design without the turbocharger, using only a single-stage supercharger. The new modified prototype became the XB-39B model, and made its first flight in November 1939. This version carried armament, but lacking armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, it was much lighter than the later production models. The Air Corps ordered 12 of these planes with the new standards for evaluation under the name P-39. After completing the trials, a first order of 80 aircraft was placed. This final version of the plane was initially called P-45, but then it was changed to P-39C. The production variant retained the single-stage supercharger without the turbocharger, but that meant its performance dropped dramatically above 12,000 feet. Because of that, it couldn't serve as an interceptor or high-altitude fighter. These P-39C versions were still built without armor plating or self-sealing fuel tanks. Only 20 were built from the ordered 80 to these specifications. The remaining 60 were rebuilt with armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and different armament, and were renamed P-39D and became the production variant. Though the P-39 was somewhat lacking in performance, the Army Air Force was interested in a bigger aircraft with similar layout, and gave an order for 2 prototypes to Bell in June 1941. This new design was named XP-63. In the plane's prototype phase, Bell actually experimented with an interesting V-tail design as well, but in the end they abandoned this idea. The new plane looked very similar to the P-39, but was larger in every aspect. It was longer by 2 feet, the wingspan was increased by 4 feet, so the wing area was 16% larger, and its weight was 1,300 pounds more. It also used a much more powerful 1800 horsepower engine, which used a secondary supercharger for added performance at high altitudes. Thanks to that, the P-63 had a 10,000 feet higher service ceiling. The new engine was also complemented by a new 4-bladed propeller. The easiest way to tell the two aircraft apart are the rounded tail on the P-39 and square one on the P-63, 3-bladed propellers on the P-39 and 4-bladed on the P-63. The armament on the P-63 was the same as on the late model P-39 fighters. Deliveries on the P-63 began in October 1943, but soon the Army Air Force concluded the new P-51 Mustang has better performance. They still ordered the P-63 into production because the Allied countries needed fighter aircraft badly, especially the Soviet Union, who were the greatest user of the P-39 fighters already. The Soviets were so keen on these planes that in 1944 they even sent one of their test pilots to help in the development. Actually, most of the changes implemented in the P-63s were input from the Soviets. For example, increased cockpit armor, added hardpoints, and moving the main cannon forward to increase ammo capacity. The P-39's armament consisted of a 37mm cannon and 2 50 caliber machine guns in the nose, and 4 30 caliber machine guns in the wings. On the later P-39Q models, they replaced the 4 30 caliber machine guns with 2 50 caliber machine guns in the wings. The P-63 used the same armament as the late model P-39Qs. The P-39 used the Ellison V1710 35 liquid-cooled engine with a single-stage supercharger producing 1150 horsepower, while the P-63 used the V1710 117 engine producing 1800 horsepower with an additional supercharger. The maximum speed was 368 miles an hour at 12,000 feet for the P-39 and 410 miles an hour at 25,000 feet for the P-63. The combat range was 525 miles for the P-39 and 450 miles for the P-63. While the P-39 service ceiling was only 32,100 feet, the P-63 could reach 43,000 feet. After the US entered the war and before the more powerful fighters were introduced, the already serving P-39s were thrown into the fights in the South Pacific and North Africa. Though the P-39 couldn't really compete at high altitudes, but at low altitudes it was a good turn fighter, it was sturdy and carried a heavy armament. On the Pacific they were outclassed by the better Japanese aircraft in most aspects, but nonetheless they held their ground, and by 1942 the P-39s claimed some 80 air kills. With their heavy armament they were also very effective ground attackers. At low altitudes they could also fight the Japanese Zeros, even though the Japanese planes still had the upper hand. The P-39s were used in North Africa and later in the Italian campaign. Here they could fight the enemy planes on more or less equal footing, unlike at the Western European theater, where the air battles were fought at high altitudes more often than not. The US Army Air Forces never used the P-63 in combat, though some of them were used for pilot training. As with many fighter planes in World War II, the British were the first to use the P-39s. They ordered 675 units in 1940. These planes had a different armament from the US models. They replaced the 37mm cannon with a 20mm one, and they had 7.7mm machine guns in the wings instead of the 30 caliber ones. The British expectations were based on the much lighter, unarmored XP-39 prototype, so when the production variant were delivered, they found them lacking in performance. The cockpit layout and visibility received lots of criticism as well. In the end, there was only one squadron actually equipped with P-39s, and their only operational action with the RAF was attacking barges on the Channel in August 1941. The RAF rejected the type from combat in early 1942, so the remaining planes were shipped from England to the Soviet Union. As we mentioned earlier, the biggest user of these aircrafts was the Soviet Union. Though these fighters were not very useful in Western Europe, where most air battles were fought at high altitudes, on the Eastern Front the situation was very different. There were no high-altitude bomber formations to attack or defend, and the Soviet Air Force was mainly built to assist the land forces. So on the Eastern Front the air battles were fought at low to medium altitudes, and the Cobras could take on the German fighters at equal footing. The Soviet pilots developed tactics to rely on the strength of these aircrafts, and they could take on the German Bf-109s at the lower altitudes. They applied many modifications to the aircraft as well. Many P-39s had their wing-mounted machine guns removed, which improved the roll rate. 4,719 P-39 Airacobras were sent to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and some of them were in service until 1949. The P-63 Kingcobras were supplied to the Soviet Union from early 1944. The delivery of the P-63s to the Soviet Union is a story by itself. From the Bell plant, the planes were flown to Alaska with several stops, where Soviet pilots took over and flew them over the Bering Strait to the Soviet Union. The US government built many airfields for this purpose. Though there was an agreement that the P-63s were not allowed to be used against the German forces, only on the Far East, there are reports stating that they were indeed used against the Germans. From the P-63s, a total of 2,397 were delivered to the Soviet Union. Some of them were still in use until the 1950s. The Free French forces in North Africa were equipped with P-39s after Operation Torch and used them until 1944 over the Mediterranean. 114 P-63s were delivered to the French in 1945, but they were too late to see combat, though later they participated in the Indochina War in 1951. The Italians received 170 P-39s in June 1944. They flew their first mission in September the same year. The planes that survived the war were used as training aircraft until the 1950s. Though the P-39 and P-63 didn't have the performance of the top US fighters like the P-51, the P-47 or the Corsair, they still had a big part in winning the war, holding the line until the newer, better fighters arrived, and most importantly, helping on the Eastern Front, where most of them were shipped to be used by the pilots of the Red Army. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.